This program has been brought to you by Zoho Corporation.
Hello and welcome. I'm Kamla. My guest today is Punit Soni. He's an engineer, investor, and an advisor to startups, and also an entrepreneur. He just spent some time in India as the chief product officer of one of the companies that is a unicorn, Flipkart. Welcome to the show, Punit.
Thank you for having me, Kamla.
So your last position was as chief product officer of an Indian unicorn company, Flipkart. Tell us, let's just pull back, e-commerce. What have you learned about e-commerce overall?
It's interesting. I always joke with people that almost every gig I've taken is in a completely different sector. And so I started in enterprise. I've done search. I've done mobile apps. I've done hardware. I think the big thing that you learn when you actually get into e-commerce is that unlike many of the other pure software things we do, it's a much more structured business. There is huge operating costs. It's very operational in the way you actually structure it. If you make mistakes, then the impact is on millions of people, and those people actually have the product in your hands. And sometimes you can't control it, especially if you're a marketplace, because there's all sorts of sellers who you may not have any direct relations with, who are the ones who are actually supplying this. So e-commerce, in many ways, shopping is probably one of the most basic tasks that human beings do. And you're now taking it online and using the power of scale, or power of internet to scale it. In effect, affecting thousands of habits, millions of people. So the burden of responsibility is much more significant sometimes.
And what role does technology play in that then?
Well, you can't really, there's not enough money and people in the country to actually support India's e-commerce ambitions. Without technology, you can't scale. I'll give you a simple example. Let's say you open your platform and make it a marketplace. Let's say you start selling watches. So a lot of different sellers will come in and they will want to sell watches. How do you know which ones are fake? All the user is looking at is a photo and he's clicking and saying buy. Can you actually go and look at every single watch and then check it before you send it to the person? Impossible. You can't scale.
So you can't authenticate it.
So then what you need to build is a machine learning model that actually looks at pricing and looks at the watch and looks at images and figures out that this might be fake, and then you actually have somebody look at it. So without technology, you're talking about millions of dollars of fake sales.
So what do you think shopping is going to be like in future, having spent some time in the e-commerce space? Globally, how do you think we're going to be shopping 5-10 years from now? Are we going to be sitting in our living room, like Apple says, and watch on TV and shop from there?
Well, I don't know how TV will be at that point. TV will be a different entity altogether. I think if you really think about shopping, what's really happening is the shortening of the time from when you think of something to the time that you have it. If you think about early days, what used to happen was you said, well, I think I might need a piece of a shoe, a pair of shoes or something. So you think about it, then you go out, you research, you find 6 shops, you find something, you come back. It's a lot of investment of time and resources and energy. Now you can say, well, I'm going to just flick open my phone and try to swipe through a few shoes, and then maybe I like something that I want, click it, and a few days later it comes in. But what if a time comes where your shoe knows it's worn out and it basically sends a message to this service that actually pops up something on your phone which says, here's 5 different new styles that are here. Do you want them? You say yes, and it shows up within 2 hours because you have drone delivery that's working with last mile logistics. So the difference between intention or thought and actual action keeps decreasing. And I think that's what technology is going to bring about.
When did you get interested in technology as a kid?
I can give you a really flowery story about how as I was a kid, I was breaking things and building them, and I got excited about it. The truth is...
What did you break?
I didn't. I know. My point was, I grew up in India. My dad was a nuclear scientist, and we grew up in this place where pretty much everybody was either doctors or engineers. And so at the time that I decided I wanted to do engineering, I didn't really even know what the ramifications of that were. There was just a choice I made because I kind of didn't want to do blood work.
But your dad was an engineer, right?
My dad was a scientist.
Scientist, okay. But so you didn't talk about engineering growing up, or you didn't?
We did. I mean, we were exposed to it. I think that the choice was made because, that felt like one of the two legitimate choices to take in life. My point merely was that looking back in hindsight, there's hundreds of different avenues people can take, and I didn't really have the benefit of that exposure. I went to, my undergrad without understanding what would happen if I actually became an engineer. Through the process of it, I learned little bit. Exposure to any particular area creates some amount of passion for it. What I realized over time was that engineering is a mechanism with which you learn things. The fact that I didn't know e-commerce before I got into e-commerce, or didn't really know hardware before I got into building hardware devices is irrelevant. In 2 or 3 months, you will learn it because engineering teaches you how to learn.
Or problem solve.
And so that is exciting to me. That is something that over the years I've become much more passionate about.
Okay, so it was a choice that. It's a default choice if you grew up in India.
Started as a default choice, became a logical extension when I did my master's. And then around the time I started thinking of business school, it became a foundational thing. It became something I would use to actually do things that I was more excited about or more interested in.
Were you good in math and science?
Yeah, I was reasonably good, pretty good.
You didn't encounter any problems when in high school in math?
No.
And who helped you with your math homework? Dad?
Dad. Actually, no, Mom. Dad would help with physics, I was relatively good in academics, so for most subjects I would try to do well, and I was doing well. My mom was probably the person who put in most effort. I would say that late nights, sitting around with me so that I'm not the only person who's working when everybody else is sleeping. She would just stay up with me and make sure. And it's not like the traditional, oh, I will feed you or something. This was, let's go and do this. I'm going to see if you did it right. So she actually knew all the stuff that I was actually learning in 9th and 10th grade and in high school. So I think she put in a tremendous amount of effort to make sure that I excelled at whatever I did.
Was she a teacher?
She should have been, in my opinion. I think she's probably would make an exceptional teacher. For us, she was.
Okay, so she helped you through.
Yeah.
So you finished your undergrad, and how did you come to America?
When I was finishing up my undergrad, my dad said that I should go and do a master's program in US. I didn't want to do it at all.
Why?
I wanted to stay in India, and I wanted to, kind of grow up and, study there. I actually thought IIMs would be a good idea, so I thought maybe I'll go and get an MBA or something. My dad pushed me that I should go take a shot at this. I was perhaps mildly iconoclastic. I said I'll do it, but I will do it only without taking any resources from you. So I'll try to get a scholarship. To some extent, that was kind of the intention, and it worked out pretty well.
So you applied to schools and got full scholarship in one college?
Yeah, I applied to a bunch of different schools. I think Rensselaer and Chicago and a couple of other places, but I also got into University of Wyoming, which is a funny story. Was I was telling somebody I'm going to University of Wyoming, and they said, "Is that in China?" So most people didn't really know where it was.
Did you know where Wyoming was?
I found out. I got admission into it. I got admitted to a wonderful professor to work with a wonderful professor. Who was pretty much one of the leading lights of electronic design automation, which is the area that I wanted to work in. I just left and decided that I'll try to figure it out, and so it was pretty interesting. Though I would say that people tried to scare me. I remember when I was flying in from Denver from New York, first time, there was a lady sitting next to me in the airplane, and she was like, "Are you sure you want to go there? I mean, there's cowboys with guns and women have mustaches." I'm like, "What is this place?" I think she was just joking, but it was funny.
So how did you come to Wyoming? What was your journey like? Which airlines did you take?
I don't remember. I think it was probably one of the cheaper ones. I landed at 2 in the morning.
Where did you land?
In Denver, Denver International Airport. In those days, the older airport was there. Now they have a fancy new one.
So you come to Colorado.
Yeah.
Denver, Colorado.
Came to Colorado.
Okay.
In this, you can't really fly into Wyoming. There's small airports, but nothing from international. I had a person from my university, an Indian student from 1 year ahead, who had actually driven in 2.5, 3 hours to pick me up, because they were afraid that I would probably be overwhelmed. And that's probably one of the more important things that you learn when you get here, the amount of help and infrastructure you get from the community. They call America the immigrants' paradise in some ways. If you're good and you do the right thing, then it helps you succeed. Boy, the day I stepped onto the country, I've always had help along the way, and so that's how I kind of came and started the process of settling down.
Very cold.
Very cold, interest in early days were weird. I think the first meal I had was in Applebee's or something, which was quite an experience of its own. Driving for 2.5 hours through darkness in 2 in the morning to get to a place called Laramie was an experience of its own. I think I fainted like 3 days in, because Laramie's at like 8,000 feet above sea level, and I thought I could just play soccer the way I used to play on sea level. So that was an experience. But my professor was amazing. The colleagues, classmates were amazing. I don't think I had a single Thanksgiving that I was by myself. There was usually a local family who would invite us over. I had all the luck and privilege and affection and support that I could get from the country.
Yeah, a lot of students that come from India and elsewhere go through the same process.
Yes, absolutely.
And they get a lot of help. And then you decided, your professor, you went and talked to him and found out, what should I do next?
Yeah, I mean, I had a few opportunities. The truth is, I thought graduating from Wyoming, it might be hard to get a pretty good opportunity. But it was the internet boom days, so I was lucky. At those days, if you had a pulse and you knew some amount of coding, you would get a job. And so I think I had like a few job offers. One of them was in Colorado Springs, and the other one was here. And my professor was, if you want to retire and have a beautiful life and relax and raise children and just have a good time, then hang out here in Colorado Springs. I'm sure it's a great place, but but if you want to really be in the middle of things and you want to really see what the cutting edge of tech is and what's going on, then go to Bay Area. And I'm glad I followed his advice. I ended up here.
So you come to San Francisco, you work in a couple of startups, and then you decide to go and do an MBA. Why was that? Why did you want to do an MBA?
My story is a classic template story to some extent. Why do we do engineering? Why did we graduate? Why did we do masters? A lot of people do masters. Why do you come to Bay Area to do? A lot of people do that too. A lot of people from there on say that they want to actually go to business school. So I did all those things. In fact, the day I finished my masters, I started preparing for GMAT, because I thought I will give it, and then within the next 5 years, at some point when the score's valid, I'll apply. I wanted to do it mostly because I wanted to reinvent myself. I felt that I had made choices in life that were putting me on a very steady linear path, but it was a linear path. I wanted something that would disrupt it, take some risks. I didn't feel like I'd taken too many risks before that. People say, going to Wyoming with $800 of debt, or cash in your pocket is a risk. I don't think it's a risk. You have everything you need to actually get through that. Coming to Bay Area and starting a job, so many people do it. I don't see any risk in it. I felt I wanted to do something that would actually really change the trajectory of my life and start doing things.
Did you look at somebody, or did you look at a trend and decide, I want to do an MBA? I know you said that the day you graduated, you took your GMAT. And for 5 years, the scores are valid. But why did you wait? You took a few jobs after you graduated, and you waited, what, 4 years?
Yeah, I mean, mostly because by then I had understood that if you really wanted to go to business school, it's better to learn how to operate in a working place and learn what kind of challenges. If you don't understand the questions, what are you going to go seek answers for? And I think that's probably one of the biggest reasons I always recommend take a few years and then go back to school, because your perspective will be very different. And I think in my case, my perspective was very different by the time I actually decided to apply a couple of years later. Come up with really thoughtful and fancy answers on why exactly I did business school. I think the simple answer is I wanted to change the trajectory of my career. I wanted to disrupt. I wanted to take a risk. I wanted to, most of my schools were really good schools, but none of them were like these highly embellished, like very well-known schools. I wanted to basically prove to myself I could go to a really good school and excel.
Like an Ivy League school.
Why not? So I had all those reasons. In hindsight, I don't know how much they matter, but they definitely did lead to the chain of events that have led me to where I am right now.
And applying for MBA school was not an easy process.
Not for me. I mean, I think I always tell people, Brown, high GMAT score, engineering degree, a couple of years of Bay Area tech experience. It's like millions of us. I feel like top schools must be bored of looking at applications for so many of us. And the truth is, that's how you are looked at. When you get in, it's nobody's fault. It's just the way you are. So then, how do you become a person? How do you go from all of those tags that are attached to you to Punit? And that journey was hard. First year I applied to some of the top 20 schools, got rejected universally, didn't really get anywhere.
Because there was nothing differentiating you.
Yeah, it's just another one, similar setup.
So what did you do after the first year rejection?
Then I said, okay, let me try to the first motivation was, let me try to explore aspects of my personality above and beyond, what I'm about or what it looks like I'm about on paper. I liked running, so I started training for marathons. I was very interested in child psychology. So
Why?
It's just something that, over the years I had read, I just had a fascination for. I was always curious about how, as children are growing up, they're so almost like a clean slate, and how they almost get layers and layers on top of them as the time goes. So it's something that I just wanted to do. I went and took a couple of courses. I got very interested. Then I went into, an organization where I spent time mentoring children from disadvantaged background. That was interesting. Then, I was interested in mountaineering, so I started climbing. Started doing a bunch of these things. And initially I did them with a purpose. I thought it'll make a good story.
And differentiate you when you apply again.
Of course, absolutely. And then I applied again and didn't get in anywhere.
So all that you'd worked on didn't help?
Maybe it did, but the timing was still off. So by the time I actually applied the third time, the process of actually applying had made me different. My perspective was different. I think I had a deeper understanding and empathy for what it took for parents to bring up children in a society where it can be pretty difficult for a single parent to do that. I had a deeper understanding of, what it takes to push yourself beyond your physical limits. I thought I couldn't run more than 4 or 5 miles. I had a ligament injury. Doctor said you couldn't even run. To run 26.2 miles consistently, and then you realize it's actually all in the mind. Physically, you can do almost anything you want to do. So I had a deeper sense of what kind of a person I wanted to be. And then when I wrote my essays in my application, it was a different person. And by the third year, I applied to the top 5 schools and I got into pretty much all of them.
And so you decided to go to Wharton?
Yes.
Okay. So you spent 2 years at Wharton. You incur a debt of $250,000.
Approximately.
And I believe you also were a choreographer at Wharton?
Yes. Well, I don't think I was a choreographer at Wharton.
You dance?
I just like dancing, so.
You do?
Yeah.
Are those videos that I saw of you and some?
Yeah.
Really?
Yes.
Okay, that was a surprise. I couldn't.
Yes.
Okay, so you also did choreography at Wharton.
It's a relative term. We are business school students, so I was having fun with my friends. Is the right way to put it? We were on a stage. There were 1,000 people watching us, and we were dancing.
So what? This was Bhangra, Bollywood?
Bhangra.
Bhangra.
Yeah.
Okay.
Punjabi. What do you expect?
You're from the Punjab.
Yes.
So then, when you graduate from Wharton, what decision did you make? Why did you decide to come back to the Bay Area? You could have, ended up doing something else on the East Coast.
What has happened over the years has been a steady increase in the ability to take risks. And that may coincide with the steady understanding or increasing understanding of confidence that it's okay. It's actually not a big deal. By the time I was in the second year of Wharton, I thought I wanted to do venture capital. The cycle of recruitment of venture capital is very at the end of graduation. By the time I actually got a couple of jobs, I decided they were not the right ones for me. I hadn't really started a company from start. I hadn't really operated companies from a business perspective. Who was I to actually start investing in and advising companies on how they should grow?
You hadn't climbed that mountain.
No, I mean, I'm a player. Well, how could I become a coach that quickly? I had just barely started learning how to play. And so, I decided that I didn't want to do that. And then basically, I pinged a few alum, and one of them was in Google. They referred me, and I got a job in Google.
And Google was your meal ticket.
Google was amazing. It was the seminal, in many ways, experience of my life. For the next, 7-8 years, I was in Google working in a variety of different groups. Every 2 years, I was doing different things in the company and learning a lot. Though it was pretty obvious, everything in life becomes a linear path ultimately. And so, you start your undergrad, it's a linear path. Then you take off to US, you have a jump. Then you have another linear path when you're doing your business school. Google was another linear path. So at some point, I had to figure out how to disrupt that too.
Have you ever spoken to your mother, because she's a philosophy major? Have you ever talked to her about your life and the linear path?
I think, I would say that between my mom and dad, my mom is the one who usually says, keep disrupting, She's more supportive of my crazy jumps. It probably stems in from some sense of philosophy around it's going to be okay. I think
because your dad has had a linear path.
My dad's a scientist, He likes his research and he's got a more linear way of doing things. Though I think post-retirement he's gotten a little bit more, risk-taking. But my mom from the start had always told us, keep just doing crazier things. You will have fun. You will get there. You'll find a way. And we actually do. Okay. Most of the time.
So the 7-8 years in Google was another pivot in your life?
Yes.
Okay. What was it that you learned at Google? Talk to us about Google's culture shaping your thought process.
Tremendously. I would say respect. Innovation comes when you actually allow people the space to think. Innovation comes when you don't micromanage, when you try to move beyond the politics of the kind of things you need to do and to the exact area or the exact problem you're trying to solve. The fixation of user at the end of the day and the problems they have and trying to solve issues for them, these are all things that Google teaches you. I think the biggest thing is, in Larry and Sergey, we have such incredible role models. It's something I talk about a lot. I think that we just don't have enough role models to look up to when we actually are building companies. These people could have been infinitely more richer. They are very rich. They could have probably focused on their own ivory tower and not really worried about all of us. But they channeled a substantial amount of resources back into the employee base. They gave us the freedom to come up with crazy ideas. They gave us the liberty to actually go and make these mistakes and do things. I think that Google embodies what in many ways Larry and Sergey's philosophy is. And in many ways, it's spun off a whole new generation of companies. Look at all the startups around us. They try to emulate in many different ways what Google's done. And so for me...
Why do you think they don't succeed, those startups?
Some do, some don't. I think that culture by itself is not enough.
What else is needed?
You need a great team first.
How do you build a team? What have you learned from building a team?
Try to find people who are better than yourself. It is very hard to do. And it's almost a cliche in many ways.
But if you found somebody better than yourself, on a day-to-day basis, would you be able to handle them? Because
yes.
If they challenged you, you're okay with it?
Yes. That's the only way it works. That's the only way it works. I've had teams of people, entrepreneurs of companies we have acquired. I've had product managers in my team, all of who I respect deeply. And because I respect deeply and I think they are amazing at what they do, they may be at a slightly different stage in their life. Maybe 3 years later, they might be in a position that's even higher than my position. But they are spectacularly smart people and doing great things. So if you can empower them and free them up, first of all, you scale better. You just become much better at what you do. Second, you build an A+ team. The truth is, if you hire B people, you end up with a C team. And if you hire A people, you end up with an A+.
Sometimes, C people can also do very well if they get the right atmosphere.
But then they are A people. They just don't have had that mentorship yet.
Okay.
And so, how do you hire a great team? You have to have a sense or a judgment of a person's character and personality. and have a sense of how you can actually help, if anything, if there's anything you can do to actually bring it out. And then you free them up. And more often than not, it works well. My best teams are teams that have had people who are smarter than me.
So you worked on Google Social?
Yes.
Okay, and how would you rate your work there? What did you learn from there? Because Google Social had its ups and downs.
Yeah, I mean, look, I did 4 things at Google. I was in search, then I was in the mobile apps group, then I was in social, and then I did Motorola. I think the last 4 things I've done in my career, in general, like, mobile apps, Motorola, social, and Flipkart, it's been like 50% success rate. I would say Flipkart's not really a success for me. I don't think Google Social was that successful. I think that mobile apps and Motorola were tremendously successful.
So what did you learn from the successes and the failures?
I think with successes, the critical thing is, many of these had the right culture. Some you actually have to build a lot of the culture. In Moto, it's a cultural evolution. It's not necessarily just a technological and product evolution. In Flipkart, it's a cultural conversation. It's not just a product and tech conversation. What you learn is that, first of all, invariably, if you want to bring about change, you can have great tech ideas, great product ideas, great insights, etc. But ultimately, a leader's job is to transform culture and thinking.
So a leader is the key.
Absolutely. And in places where you can actually create that culture, companies succeed. In places where you're unable to create that culture, companies don't succeed. And so to me, basically, the conversation usually starts with, what setup am I going into? What are the other leaders like? How's the team? How are they thinking? What are their motivations? What do they feel afraid of? What are their challenges? You work on that first. And then later on, you come up with a technical or product insight that can help go to market or whatever else you're trying to solve. And so that's probably my biggest learning. In all of these places, ultimately, we have been working in cultural transformations.
Got you. So when you graduated from Wharton, you thought you would become an investor and realized that you just needed to go and learn the game. Now you've learned the game to a large extent, and you've spent time in different environments.
Yeah.
And you're ready to don the hat of an investor.
Well, now what I've realized is that you can invest on the side all the time. You can be an investor. You don't have to. Investments can be a full-time or a part-time role. It doesn't matter. It's just a role.
So you're still looking for your next gig?
Yeah, I'm looking for my next passion. That's probably the right way to put it. With Google, and Motorola and Flipkart, I'm again on another linear trajectory. If I want, I probably, privileged or lucky enough that I could get like a, CEO position somewhere or a SVP some position somewhere. But that still feels like a linear path now. And so now I'm asking myself, how do you disrupt this? I don't know the answer to it, so I have to think hard about it. Maybe starting something, maybe finding something I'm super passionate about and going and doing it from scratch. I don't know. I don't know.
Okay. My last question, we've all run out of time. What phone do you use?
Well, right now I have a Nexus.
Okay. So you're faithful to your...
I love Android and I love, all the devices we made. I just don't have a Moto phone, but I have a Nexus phone now.
Punit, thank you so much for stopping by and talking to us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back again with another episode next week. If you missed any of our shows, you can catch them on our YouTube channel.
This program has been brought to you by Zoho Corporation.